Hi, this is Don with Through Gamer Goggles. That's gamer-goggles.com. And we're going to take just a few minutes and talk a bit about the basics of movement for Heavy Gear by DreamPod 9. The very first thing I want to talk about is the movement statistics on the sheet, which explains to you the fact that there are actually two movement modes and such, which I'll show right here. When you look at the individual sheets for the different vehicles and gears, especially gears is what we'll focus on today, the movement is in this section of the sheet right here. You've got speed, modifiers for stop, combat, and top speed across the top. You've got W. In the case of the gears, there's always a W, which is the walker mode or walking mode. And then there'll be a secondary movement mode. In the case of the Jaeger, which is what we're going to talk about today, the G is for ground movement, which is basically like a set of roller skates on the bottom of their feet. When you activate a gear, you will have chosen ahead of time or at the start of the activation which movement mode you'll be moving in. In the case of walking, you've got two stats. The 4 is combat speed. Before the slash, the 4 is combat speed. After the slash, the 7 would be what they call top speed. In ground movement mode, it's just slightly faster because you've now switched off of running and onto a set of roller skates or a set of tank treads. So I'll show just real briefly, like for this gear, knowing that its stats are what they are here. I'm going to show you what a Jaeger looks like doing just some of the basic movements. So here we are. The Jaeger is a general purpose gear for the South. Very, very common in all of the armies that I play because I think it's sexy. So in the case of, at the start of the game, you always start out at combat speed. I have a tendency to always start out in the walking combat speed. So in the case of this gear, you have 4 inches of movement when it's at combat walker. So in combat speed, you always have to move 2 inches before any turns. When you're stopped, you can make up to 2 turns without any movement, and at top speed, you have to move 3 inches. So I've got, in walker mode, I've got 4 inches of movement. Basically, I can move that first 2 inches and then make a 60-degree turn, which is 1 hex space on their hex spaces, and then continue my movement. And that would finish a walking movement in combat speed. Top speed for the walking on this particular gear is 7, which basically it's just like what I just showed you, except that you would have to go 3 inches before turning. But in a 7-inch movement at top speed, you move your first 3 inches, make up to a 60-degree turn, move at least 3 more inches, and you can actually squeeze a second turn out of that movement of 60 degrees. And this all needs to be kept in mind because once we get to the video where we talk about terrain and such, you'll see that it's a planning stage that you have to kind of keep in your mind. Otherwise, you wind up running into the terrain or over the terrain or through the terrain. You can move one or shift one movement type at the start of each of your activations. So, and moving at combat speed doesn't take an action itself. It's just assumed that you're moving. To move at top speed, you do get the better modifiers that I showed on the sheet a moment ago. However, it takes your action for the turn to sustain that kind of speed and not just run over everything, I guess, or run through everything. The newest faction for Heavy Gear, the new Cole stuff, and also the CEF, which is Earth Forces, their secondary movement mode is hover, and those generally move a lot faster, which is going to allow you for a lot more maneuverability, but it also, you have to keep in mind that 3-inch requirement for ground mode and the 4-inch requirement for hover mode. One of the most interesting things about Heavy Gear and DreamPod 9, the way that they've handled their movement, is if you pick up counter and dice packs for Heavy Gear Blitz, they come with movement dice to help you track what each gear is moving. The faces of the die tell you exactly what's going on. Like this would be your primary movement or walker movement for in the case of gears. When you at combat speed, you shift up the top speed. You just turn the die. They've got a stop sign for stopped. Secondary movement just adds a chevron to let you know that you're in your secondary movement mode, and secondary top is there. And the sixth face is for secondary movement stopped or prone if you go to ground. So I'm going to give just a quick show of a couple of movement phases using the different movement modes on our little piece of fantastical terrain. So we'll assume that the Jaeger has started off at combat speed ground movement mode, which is the what I was talking about earlier with it's got a set of roller skates that pop out of the bottom like a fantastic little kid's shoes. So at combat speed ground movement, it has up to 6 inches of movement. Because you're at combat speed, you only have to move 2 inches before a turn. So what I'm going to do is try and take this guy across here, and we're going to maneuver him through the barrels and see how this goes. So 2 inches, and then you get up to a 60-degree turn, and then another 2 inches, and a 60-degree turn, which is going to put me right into the barrels, which is exactly what I intended not to do. That's all fixed. So, and then with the last 2 inches, we'll move up into the terrain. Now, getting into some sticky terrain like that, that would end my first movement phase. There's a shooting phase, there's shooting to be done, and so on and so forth, but I don't have any enemies here on the table. So, for the next turn, when I activate this gear, oops. Okay. I'm going to drop to walker movement, my primary movement mode, because I'm in the terrain now, and I want to have more control, I guess, over my movement. So I would just go ahead and move my first 2 inches. Actually, in the case of walking movement, I think I would go ahead and move the 4 and get myself up to the edge of this terrain, and then take my 60-degree turn at the end. And that would end my second turn of movement. With the die, you keep the dice close to the gear so you know which one moved where. And then we go into the third turn of movement. The start of the third activation for this gear, I want to get a tight turn around the terrain. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the gear. When a gear is stopped, it can make up to 2 60-degree turns, or 120 degrees worth of turns, and it can move up to 1 inch. So I would move the gear up into the opening using my handy-dandy Heavy Gear tape measure. And at this point, I can actually turn as much as I need to, up to 120 degrees, to get myself in position for the start of the next movement phase. And basically, a fourth movement phase is just going to let me go ahead and run right off the table, which is what I want to do. That's the basics of Heavy Gear movement. There's a lot more to it once you involve terrain and such, and we will do that very shortly in another video. Thank you for stopping by. Remember, gamer-goggles.com.